Hello, folks. Welcome to Holding On with Holder, where I talk to interesting people about interesting topics. My name is Steve Holder, and I am your host. My guest this evening is Bobby Hedglin-Taylor. He is an actor, dancer, author, and several other things. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Recently in a podcast, somebody called me the multi-hyphenated artist, so I'm using it. I
Okay,
figured, hey, I like it. It works for me.
there
So,
you go. So tell us a little bit about your background, Bobby. Who are you?
so I was born in Pennsylvania in the Pocono Mountains, and I was raised on the top of a mountain there. My parents both poor factory workers, and I moved to New York to pursue the dream of being an actor, dancer, singer, and here I am, 30 plus years later, and still doing it, still working. And yes, art is not just paint and a paintbrush. Art can be singing, dancing, and also for a lot of my adult years, I was a trapeze artist. So that in itself was what defined me for so many years. And as I'm in my 50s now, I look back at my whole artistic career and my paintbrushes were just different. They were just, whether I was using a microphone or an actual paintbrush or whether I was using a trapeze bar or, uh, you know, being behind the bar and being a mixologist, so it's like I had my tools and I was always artistic as a kid. So I knew I was going to do something artistic. I just didn't know what. And lo and behold, I've done many things artistically.
Yeah.
So
So you were in the circus for a while then.
about 30 years of my life has been devoted to the
Wow.
circus world. I'm one of only six people who started the circus arts world here in New York City. There were six people. There were me and five ladies, and we did a lot of nightclub work, which was new to the New York night scene.
Yeah.
So as we were training, um, we all had the same coach too. There was one coach, and she was a Ukrainian Olympian, and she taught us in this little studio on the Upper West Side, and we all got really good really fast, and then we started to get work.
Yeah.
So with that, we started to do the nightclubs and then small circuses and small variety shows. There were a lot of shows popping up downtown that were in these small studios, but they had high ceilings, so we could do acrobatics and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I, being the only man, was low on the totem pole because the nightclub folks wanted to see the pretty ladies over the dance floor.
Yeah.
So I would have to wait most of the time just when one of them would be out and I would get my chance to perform. And back then, there weren't a lot of circus apparatus, let alone circus schools. And now I run a circus school. That's part of my job. My job that pays the bills is
Yeah.
that. But I'm also one of the things I do in theater and on Broadway and off Broadway is I'm what's called an aerial sequence designer and coach. So what I do is I train actors to fly either in a harness or using circus apparatus. So that became a sort of a side career that that brought me back to my roots in theater because I started out in theater. And so putting them all together, I was able to work on Broadway with Andrea Martin was one of my favorites to
Yeah.
work with, and Tova Feldshuh. I trained them both in their 60s to do trapeze, and so that became something that was a high point for me, no pun intended. But being able to meld my two worlds of both theater and circus, and the acrobatics, and actually tell stories with the acrobatics. So I was using the human body as my paintbrush
Yeah.
and being able to make the story like you were turning the page of a story, but you're watching it in the middle of the air.
So you was able to follow your dreams and everything worked out.
Well, I don't know if you can say that. Well, there were a couple things. I always knew I wanted to live in New York because
Yeah.
I'm from Pennsylvania. We're only an hour and a half from New York City. So I was coming to New York all through the 1970s, either on school trips or with my cousin. My cousin and I would go to Broadway shows, and we would go to different. She would take us to the museums. I saw my first circus, and so I had the performing arts was always around me. And one of my aunts was a USO performer, so she was a tap dancer. And so she was very excited to find out that I wanted to tap dance. And when I finally did, she came to see me in a show in Connecticut and told me all the stories about the USO. And so I it was not my family was not happy with my nuclear family. My mom and dad were not happy with it. They wanted me to settle down in Pennsylvania,
Get a
have
real
get a
job.
job, get a real job, and just just live this safe life. And I
Yeah,
don't do anything. Obviously, I don't do anything safe.
yeah, that's
Safety,
not
safety.
part of you,
I
is
fear safety. I fear safety, and I fear routine. I loved stepping it up. I love like writing a book this past year. I wrote 2 books in 1 year, and we had a pandemic, so there was no acrobatics happening. And so I just went, I got to take this and run with it. And when the pandemic began, um, my mom died in a nursing home 11 days after the lockdown. So
she died of COVID, correct?
we believe so. There was no tests at that point, and then I didn't find out until much later, talking to different people who had worked in that facility, and they were like, "You're pretty sure that's
Yeah.
what it was," because the day after she died, I woke up with 104 fever. I had no taste or smell, and I had a headache that was unlike any other headache I'd ever had before, and I had COVID. So it was pretty clear that it was in the nursing home when she had it, and I got it from visiting her. And so no one knew. We were warned so late. And
Yeah.
New York was first to shut down, especially Broadway. I remember I went to see a matinee of a Broadway show because the nursing home lockdown was March 11th, but March 10th I stopped over to the nursing home to see my mom. Something in my head said, even if it's 30 minutes, go sit with her, because she had just been to the ER and I was taking trips with her to the ER. And she would tell me these incredible stories of growing up in Pennsylvania and when she was young, and stories of my youth. Like my first words were fucking reindeer. According to my mother, fucking reindeer was my first words. And
Okay.
so I took those nuggets and I wrote a cookbook about my mom and about growing up in Pennsylvania. And I'm Italian. I know I don't look it, but our family's you can tell I'm talking with my hands. If you tie my hands behind my back, I won't be able to say anything. But my family's mostly Sicilian, and half the family is Sicilian and Greek, and then the other half is Sicilian. So my grandmother was the eldest of 13, and my great grandfather and my grandfather found a plot of land on top of a mountain in Pennsylvania. And all of my great grandfather's children, his 13 children, settled around him. So the top of this mountain was like the Italian Ionasport, because everyone was related, and you never had a neighbor that wasn't a relative.
Really?
So it was this little microcosm on top of a mountain. So all those stories started coming back as I was talking with mom. So and she had little nuggets of wisdom, and in those little nuggets of wisdom, I would share them on social media under the hashtag shit my mama says. And so she had all the catchphrases on earth. She had opinions about everything. And so I wrote them into a coffee table book. And so the 2 books sort of came out of this surrounding this horrible situation where I couldn't go to work. I couldn't do what I normally do. Broadway is shut down. Can't go to the movies. It takes 2 hours to get into the supermarket, and you only have 30 minutes to get in and out because they didn't want to shut down the supermarkets. We had refrigerator trucks outside of every funeral home. We had refrigerator trucks outside of every hospital. We had makeshift morgues on the sidewalk, and it
Was
was a
this in the
scary time.
spring of last year or all through the
Yeah,
year?
it was exactly 1 year ago.
Yeah.
March 21st, mom died, and March 22nd, 23rd is when I had my first COVID symptoms.
Yeah.
And so I hadn't even turned over the check to the funeral director, um, because it all happened so quickly. And then I remember walking to the supermarket and seeing my mother's the funeral home where mom was, seeing the refrigerator truck, and it's probably where she was until she was cremated. But that should, that was a comfort. At least I knew where she was. I knew that, that someone would take care of her eventually, and we would get her ashes back. It took
Yeah.
about 6 weeks for the ashes to come back. Um, so I started to write, and I didn't have therapy at that time. It was not really something that I could even fathom talking about. But I just started to write, and I started to write her recipes and her stories, and it made me laugh so much that I said I have to share this. Like, her death is not in vain, and the thing is, because I'd been sharing shit my mama says hashtag for 5 years that she's been in the nursing home, she had a fan base because when she died, people would send me text after text. Oh my God, I remember when your mom was talking about, trimming her vagina and she wanted me to bring her scissors. And I was like, Mom, you can't have scissors in the nursing home. But, but they remembered these crazy stories and they connected with her as if they knew her. And I feel like that's my job as her son, to let the world know that this is who she was. And yes, we've had a crappy year, but you can still laugh. And we're planning her funeral for August 7th, which is her birthday. And
Oh, you
because
didn't
she was
get to have a funeral last year at all?
No, we couldn't do a funeral. There was so much red tape with the thought of
Yeah.
uh, moving the body over across state lines in the middle of COVID, in the middle of a pandemic. There were different laws and procedures regarding embalming, going across state lines and things like that. So it would have cost thousands of dollars. And she wanted to be buried next to my dad, which I will honor her wishes. It's just the funeral home um, they couldn't even have a viewing, even if it was just me and some family members. They had notes on the door, please don't come in, we don't have space. The
Yeah.
funeral homes were overrun at that point, and this was early on, and people were dying, hundreds of people a day. That's 100 families a day, and that number went up to almost 1,500 a day. So when you think about each person that died during COVID, that's 600,000. That's 600,000 families that are affected. But even that early on in the pandemic, we we only had the daily um, the daily press conference with the governor and the mayor, and that was it. And then we were watching the news and watching for help. Who's going to help us through this? How are we going to get through this? What do we do? Do we keep our mask on? Do we not keep our mask on? Are we okay to go to the store? Are we not okay to go to the store? And it was pretty much, it wasn't said, but it was shelter in place. And
Yeah.
I buckled down and just locked the door and went to the supermarket when I had to. And as the we I live on a thoroughfare in Astoria, Queens, which is sort of like a main strip that goes directly towards the hospital. And we had uh, ambulances. Every 20 minutes, you would hear an ambulance siren go past the front window. Every 20 minutes, 24 hours a day for 3 months. And
Wow.
then if you were walking outside, sometimes you'd see somebody in the stretcher going to the hospital with some kind of a respirator on, or the body bag
Yeah.
coming out of somebody's house.
That had to
It
be
was that.
traumatic just watching all that.
Yeah, it really was. It really was. And that's why I threw myself into mom's memories. And, she was a very funny lady. Both my parents were factory workers. My father was a welder. My mother worked in a bulk mailing factory. So when I was 16, I would sign out of school at 11 or noon and go work with my mom until around 6 or 7 at night, and then I would take college courses at night. So for the last 2 years of high school, I only went to school half a day, and the rest of the day I was working, um, and just taking classes at night because I wanted to go to college. My family did not want me to go to college. My mother did not want me to go to college, but I paid my way through college. Mom helped eventually. When I moved to New York, I got a scholarship to the American Musical and Dramatic Academy here in the city. And that was where everything changed because I actually moved here. I actually lived here in the 1980s, and I got to go to this great school. I got to learn how to be an actor in New York. And then I started to get work as a dancer and a tap dancer. I was a really good tap dancer. So, and thank you, NLC, for the gusto, because she always loved that I was a tap dancer. One of my first jobs, I remember calling her. um, Chase Manhattan Bank had a big promotion, and they were hiring people to either tap dance or to be a character dancer outside of the bank. And they paid about, at this is 89, 90. So they were paying $50 an hour for you to tap dance in a cat costume. So I had this big giant cat head in the middle of the summer, drenched in sweat, tap dancing outside, handing out flyers. But it was the most rewarding job ever, because I was like, hey, I'm tap dancing on Broadway, but I'm not in the theater, just on the
Yeah.
sidewalk. But it was the start, and I started to get work, and I started to get summer stock work, and and then Circus sort of fell into my lap, because I was also bartending, I was also cocktail waitering, and I was also coat checking at different clubs in Manhattan. So you could make your rent really fast. And this gentleman was there, and he was an old Broadway dancer, and we started chatting. He talked to me back and forth, blah blah blah. And he's like, "Hey, I got this great show, and and I think you're perfect for it. I want you to come in and sing for it." And he said, "Do you have any circus skill?" And I was like, "I don't know." I said, "I can balance on one foot, but I'm a good tap dancer." And he was also a tap dancer too. He played Tulsa in the musical Gypsy on Broadway, with Angela Lansbury. So he was an old hoofer, and so I went in and I got the job. And they sent me to a coach. They sent me the only Russian coach, the only circus coach in New York City at the time. And her name was Irina, and she was a Ukrainian Olympian, and she taught me everything. And she had this no nonsense kind of a training um, technique, and it was very loving. But she could, she just knew how to manipulate your body in the air. She just knew what you needed to learn next, and where your hand needs to go, so you can hold on and not fall down. And it
Yeah.
was fascinating, and it was super expensive, but the first the show paid for it, and then I took over paying for it because I fell in love with it. And then I started to put it on my resume, and I would go to auditions, and people would be like, actor, dancer, singer, trapeze artist? What's this? Tell me about this, And then I would get an extra few minutes in the room, and sometimes get the job, just because I was interesting, because there was something interesting about trapeze to them. There was something interesting about circus to them, because we didn't have that kind of there was no community here. So when I first started, it was me and those five other ladies that all went to that same school, and that's how the circus community was born here in New York.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm a pioneer in that sense, but um, I also feel like, because I was the runt of the litter, the ladies had more. They had more more training than I did, and more
Yeah.
more time in the air than I did. And my hat is always off to those
I
six
imagine
other
there's not
five.
too many people that teach that.
Now there is.
Really?
And there's been such a huge uprise of circus arts in the United States. There are schools all over the country. There are smaller
Didn't
schools
know that.
in, yeah, there's a couple schools here in New York. I would say there's about maybe 30 locations in New York where you can learn circus arts right at this
Really?
very moment. Chicago, Madison, Wisconsin has a huge circus base there. Good friend of mine, her name is Love. She owns a new space called Cycropia, and they teach literally every circus art. Excuse me. Um, and there's Florida, of course. Florida, it was the home of circus. That's where you went to train during the winter. Oh, it's Sarasota. But now there's schools in Texas. There's schools in LA. There's like six or seven really good schools in LA. And then, of course, there's the San Francisco School of Circus Arts is what it used to be called, but now it's called the Circus Center. And I used to teach there in the 90s. And that was actually when I really started to really grind into, what am I doing, and what do I want to do with this circus career? Because the big shows then, it was hard to get into the bigger shows like Cirque du Soleil and Ringling Brothers, because a lot of the circus families still had they still had their grips on those shows, and they would go from show to show because they were doing that since the time they were born. And I wasn't. I started very late in life in comparison to most of the performers that are out there these days. But those bigger shows were harder to get into, but you still had to have the work ethic, and you had to measure up to the skill set of the people that were in those shows. And you still would get work, but there's also a huge school now in Montreal called L'École Nationale du Cirque. And it's basically the feeder school to the Cirque du Soleil shows. So if you go to L'École Nationale, then you'll end up in one of the big Cirque shows. Um, the training up there is exquisite. The people come out of there that are their their talent is they definitely hand pick these people for their talent. So yeah, so there are circus schools all over the place. I don't know about Tennessee. I think you're in Tennessee, right?
I am, yes.
What part?
Johnson City,
Okay,
in the
so
northeastern corner.
yep. So funny story. When I was younger, I was part of the Boy Scouts, and one of the one of the sectors of Boy Scouts. There's Boy Scouts, there's Cub Scouts, and then there's explorers. And I
Mhm.
was an explorer, and my explorer group, it was our theme. You each had a theme. There's some that do that only deal with pilots, only do leather working. We were we took Native American dance and culture and documented it. So we spent a lot of time in Cherokee, North Carolina,
Okay,
and every summer in the early 80s, late 70s, we were in Cherokee, North Carolina, and Gatlinburg, Tennessee.
yeah,
So that was like, and Nashville, of course, and Dollywood. That was like my summers when I was a kid.
yeah.
So so your accent brings back a lot, you
Okay.
know. But yeah, so there, I don't know about Tennessee. There may be, I believe there's a school in Nashville, but I know that there's schools popping up all over the place.
Yeah,
And there's a lot of people out there who want to do this both as an art form, but also as a fitness regimen. It's really good for you. You get super strong, you get big muscles,
yeah,
you get really fit very quickly because you're using gravity. Whenever you use gravity, and muscle mass building techniques, you will build muscle faster. And that's what happens to people when they start this kind of artwork. They're like, oh, I don't have any upper body work, any upper body, so I'm not going to try this. And then all of a sudden they realize that after a month of pulling themselves up and climbing 30 feet, they got guns. And then I always say, you don't need guns to start to get into my class. You will get them from taking my class.
yeah.
So that's and yeah, so there's schools all over the place, and it's become really popular.
Well, I just learned something.
Mm.
Yeah. So you've written two books, right?
Yes.
Both of them about your mother.
Well, the cookbook is about my family, and the most focus of that cookbook is about my time when I lived with my grandmother, which was 1977 to 79. So it was like 2 or 3 years. So I learned how to cook, how to sew, how to clean from my grandma. And I learned all those old stories as well. My grandmother tells this great story about she had a trained pig named Lucky. And Lucky was the male pig. He was the only male pig in the barn, and that's why they named him Lucky. And he was trained. He would sit. He would roll over. He was allowed in the house, and he would sit in front of the fireplace and fall asleep. Well,
Wow.
he sired many pigs and many piglets. So one day, my grandmother left the front door open when she went to the store really fast, and she came back. Lucky was asleep on in front of the fireplace, but there was about 20 piglets running through the house. He had let them in, and they were in everything. They were covered with flour. They were covered with oils. They had gone into her cupboards. They opened the refrigerator. So here's this little Italian, 4'11" Italian woman just scuttling around, grabbing piglets and throwing them in the barn. And there's Lucky passed out in front of the fireplace.
Wow.
But those stories came back to me, and they just flooded my memory. And I was like, I do a thing called I learned also. It's called mind mapping. And what mind mapping is, I learned it. I took a course on writing as I'm doing this book. I'm like, I'm not a writer, I'm not an editor, and I'm not a chef, but I'm writing a cookbook. So I needed some kind of grounding work. And there was a thing called Author Advantage Live. And I took the weekend course, and there was so much information. But there was one thing I learned called mind mapping. And what you do is if you have an idea, you put the name that idea in one or two words in the center of a page. Then you draw around it everything that comes to your mind about those two words. And when I did that, I mind mapped my book because the book was shambles by the time, by June. It was just like all over the place. I had chapters that were written, but were not, they were unfocused. Mind mapping made me focus on each chapter and what needs to be in each chapter. When I started writing recipes, I realized, oh, I have 13 recipes for breakfast. Why don't I have a chapter on breakfast and talk about Sunday breakfast with my grandma? And so that came out. But the mind mapping, once you read it and go back and read it, you see the book is there. It's like just comes out of your head. And then you just have to take each item that would be a chapter and mind map the chapter. So if you said baked pasta, that was one of my mind mapping. I immediately wrote baked ziti. I wrote eggplant parmesan. I just kept writing. And then lasagna, baked ravioli. I just like everything came around, and I was like, baked pasta. It's got to be. There's got to be. It's part of my heritage. It's part of my family. We used to make all kinds of lasagna, all kinds of baked ziti.
The lasagna.
Oh well, I have several recipes. I have to actually um, I have to do a recipe this weekend making pesto lasagna, which grandma used to make at this restaurant that she worked at. So a lot of those times that we worked together at this restaurant, and she also worked at a pizzeria and we worked there together. So I learned how to toss pizza dough with her. But the cookbook is mostly from that little nugget of time, but it was inspired by my mom, and my mom is the catalyst. And then the second book is a coffee table book called Shit My Mama Says, and it has a picture of mom on the front and on the back and 96 pages of every single quote that she had given me over the years and over the past 5 years in the nursing home. And they are hysterical. And then it's an arc as well because it shows you that you can laugh with somebody who is dealing with dementia. You can laugh with somebody who is fading away. And you can hold on to those little nuggets that they give you and still open that book and pee yourself laughing because that's who she was. And I think anyone who lost anyone to COVID over this past year, I think, or even somebody who lost any parent or any elderly relative who had that kind of a quirky personality or who had dementia, they would understand and connect to it, and it would be healing. And that's all it's about. It's about healing. It's about passing it on to people. And that's what mom's legacy is that she didn't like funerals. She didn't like sad events. She didn't like crying. She loved to laugh. She used to rent
Now,
when
was
we
she a writer?
what's that?
Was your mom a writer? Did she write books also?
No,
No?
no.
Okay.
No one in my family was ever my cousin Barbara, who I absolutely adore. She's one of my closest cousins. She actually wrote a book of poetry. Barbara Calamito is her name, and so we just figured this out because my mom passed. We reconnected, and she heard I was writing the book. She's like, that I'm a published poet, and I was like, what? So there's that. And then connecting with my cousins, I also found that the recipes that I had through my mom, they got through their moms. My mother was the middle girl of three girls. So my mother's youngest sister and her eldest sister, I'm still close with their children. They're my cousins, and their moms used to make the same things for them. So they see a lot of that. So there's a lot of that post World War II um, way of raising a family, and now it was passed down because right after World War II, my poor families, if you didn't have a pig farm or you didn't have your own garden in the backyard, whatever you raised on your own land was what you ate the rest of the year.
Yeah.
And hunting deer was very common in Pennsylvania. Deer, turkey, bear, grouse, rabbit. It was natural to grow lots of food, but also to eat off the land. And I nowadays it's like you don't know where your food comes from, at least there we knew it came from the backyard.
yeah,
And we also never used pesticides. We never used any artificial fertilizers. My mom only used chicken manure, and then she used different plants that she would plant around the perimeter of our garden so that it would keep away the groundhogs, the skunks, and anything that would try to get in. Marigolds, garlic, she would plant all the way around the garden, and that those wild um, herbs and things that would keep them away protected it. I mean, we did have to use chicken wire and things like that. Occasionally, a groundhog would break into the garden and
yeah,
eat up. But never ate a groundhog. Not good eats, from what I understand.
yeah.
But
So have you considered writing a book about the circus life? A lot of people would love that.
I thought about that too, and because I'm just finishing up these two books now, and they'll be published sometime this summer. I'm self-publishing because it's so hard to get an agent these days because a lot of people want the virtual, they want the Kindle, they want something to read on their phone. They don't want an actual hard copy of a
Yeah,
book. Cookbooks, however, are still popular because people will buy them because they like the idea of having a book and your battery never dies on your phone or your Kindle when you're in the middle of a recipe. Your hands are greasy. You just want to be able to look at the words, look at the recipe, and have it work that way. So cookbooks are still popular. Coffee table books, not so much, but I feel like I don't care if that one sells, honestly. I really want that for my family. I want
yeah,
everybody who comes to the funeral to know that, if the book is out, I'll, get a copy and I, 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 I really think though that once people see the picture of an old lady giving the finger to the nurse on the front cover with "shit my mama says," they're immediately going to say, "What is this and why should I open it?" and immediately open it and start to laugh. And I
yeah,
feel like that's the thing. And the other book, the cookbook, is part memoir and part food. So it has really good stuff. It also has alternative recipes. So if you are a vegan or a vegetarian, you can't eat my grandmother's bolognese, but you can make it with specific changes to make it suit your diet. Same thing with different types of pasta, gluten-free pasta. So in every recipe there, if it's a meat-based recipe, there's always a vegan or vegetarian option. And also I try to encourage in every recipe for people to be creative with their spices and because that's how I learned by there's few basics that you have to have, and then you can be creative with certain things. But the, the science of what makes a lasagna is eggs, cheese, pasta, and sauce. So if you have those four things, you're going to make a great but you need to make sure you're going to make a great lasagna, but you need to make sure that the quantities are correct. And if
mm,
you have too many eggs, then you get this scrambled eggs kind of thing, or if you have not enough eggs, then the cheese is runny. So it's finding that balance and giving people a chance to experiment with cooking. We've had a whole year where we had to cook at home, and my cholesterol went up because I went to my doctor. She said, "Whoa, what happened to your cholesterol?" I said, "I'm writing a cookbook," and so she's like, "Are you eating every?" I was like, "Yes," because I would make every recipe because when you write a cookbook, you have to test the recipe. You have to test it for flavor, for quantities, to make sure that it's relatable and translatable. That I can tell you, you're going to need, a 15-ounce thing of ricotta cheese. You're going to need this much lasagna noodles, blah 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 blah, and then how to do it. So, and I write the way I talk, so it's a lot of run-on sentences. So I need a good editor, and so I've been through two editors already. So I'm trying to get another one. Not because they don't like the project. Both had different things come up that they had to drop the project, but so I'm in the middle of getting the third editor acclimated. I have a great designer for the photos because I took photos on my phone, but you need professional photos for that. So I will have to go through and the things that need photo representation. I have a photographer who's great photographer. And then my book cover is a cartoon. It's cartoon drawn, and my friend Felix is doing the 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 book cover, and the book cover has little what I call Easter eggs, and they are there's a there's Lucky the pig, there's fucking reindeer because those are my first words. So they're just little nuggets so that when you look at the cover and people say don't judge a book by its cover, but the minute you see this cover, you're like, what is this? And that's what I wanted. And there's a mountain of ravioli in the background. So again, it's been in such a really great process for me not being a writer and
Yeah,
not being an editor and not know, I had to read a lot of cookbooks. I literally
yeah.
have 30 cookbooks that I've been reading, and that's been so helpful.
So when will the books be out and where can people get them?
Well, as of right now, the books should be out by the end of the summer, and they will be available on Amazon and Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com. But I'm self-publishing, so the self-publishing platform, I'm stuck between two of them, and they both use those two. One has a bigger reach and will end up in Walmart and stuff like that. So there, it depends on the publisher right now. So I'm just kind of like in that last push, that last, uh, um, just sort of the what do you call it? It's just when you're just the last lap, and I just got to tighten up all those little loose ends, and then just get it out there.
Okay.
So,
Well, I hope that works out well for you. You sell a
yeah.
million copies. And
Well, nobody's selling a million copies unless you're Stephen King, but that's all good.
yeah,
If it, but for now, the book is entitled "Escape to Ravioli Mountain: A Memoir in Food." And
okay,
if anybody wants to reach me, you can find me on the internet. On Instagram, I cook live on Instagram, and you can find me at Escape to Ravioli Mountain. And you can email me at escape to ravioli mountain at gmail.com and get on my mailing list. And then the
okay,
website will be launched next month as well. So I'll have a website. And then as I get the mailing list going, we'll tease little nuggets from the book as well. So
okay, good deal.
yeah,
Bobby, I thank you for being my guest tonight. I've enjoyed talking to you. And
you too.
I do want to encourage you to write that book about the circus life. I'm sure
I,
that will be good.
it has been, it is there are so many ideas, and yes, I
Yeah,
will mind map it. I promise you, and I'll send you the notes about it. But there are so many stories, and there are so many connections to how um, how people in the circus relate to each other. So it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of my head with that one because
yeah.
30 years in that industry, it's
I'm
been
sure you
wonderful.
have stories.
Oh, I do.
Yeah. Well,
Ask me about elephants sometime.
well, thank you very much for being on my show. Folks, be sure
Too.
to watch out for Bobby's books, Escape to Ravioli Mountains.
Yes, sir.
Did I say
A
that right?
memoir in food. Yep.
Okay. And shit, my mama taught me, is that right?
Shit, my mama says.
Okay, okay. All right. Well, thanks again, folks, for
Thank
tuning
you.
in to Holding On with Holder. Please subscribe to my channel and feel free to share this video all over social media. Well, Bobby, I will let you go and thank you very much for being with me tonight.
Thank you, Steve. Nice to meet you, and thanks for chatting.
All right. Bye bye.